Okay, thank you to everyone who has joined us for this evening's webinar, hosted by Liberation and the Stop the War Coalition. My name's Gawain. I'm the General Secretary of the General Federation of Trade Unions and very pleased to be chairing this evening's meeting. We've got a fantastic panel for you this evening to discuss the situation in Sudan and the importance of international solidarity and the work that we can do. And we hope to have plenty of time for your questions and discussion as part of the meeting this evening. A little bit of housekeeping before I introduce our panelists and before we get started. Down at the bottom of your screens, you'll see a Q&A function. If you've got any questions for our panelists, and we really would encourage those, please do put them in the Q&A at the bottom. If you click on there, you'll be able to put questions in, to put comments in, which our panelists will then respond to towards the end of the webinar. It is set up in webinar format, so don't be worried if you can't find a way to switch your camera on or unmute yourself. It's only our panelists this evening who you'll see on the screen, and that's really to handle what we think will be quite a wide-ranging discussion with a large number of people. But as I say, do use that Q&A in order to put your questions in so that you can participate and be part of this evening's discussion. So by way of opening, people will have seen the events over recent years in Sudan, the coup in October of 2021, led by the Sudanese armed forces, the development of the situation in April 2023, and during this period, this horrific situation, as of the 21st of January this year, somewhere between 13,000 and 15,000 people have been killed in fighting in Sudan, and 33,000 others injured, with sexual violence believed to be widespread across the country. As of the 29th of December, the end of last year, over 5.8 million people have been internally displaced, and more than 1.5 million others have fled the country. This evening, we are going to hear more in detail about the situation in Sudan. We're very, very pleased to be joined by Fathi El-Fadl, a long-time activist and member of the Forces of Radical Change in Sudan, steadfast opponents of the current civil war as well as the ruling military junta, and a vice president of the International Center for Trade Union Rights. Comrade Fathi was, during the 1970s and 80s, a prominent student leader in Sudan and a leading member of the International Union of Students. He's based in Khartoum and a witness at ground level with an informed take on the situation there. After we'd heard from Comrade Fathi, we'll be moving on to hear from Lindsey German, who I will introduce in a moment, but many of you will know from her long time and outstanding work in the Stop the War Coalition, to talk about the importance of our solidarity. And we hope to be joined later this evening by Jeremy Corbyn, who would also like to say a few words about the work that we can do in solidarity with Sudan. But first of all, I'm very, very pleased to hand over to introduce the topic, to tell us more about the situation in Sudan, to Comrade Fathi. The floor is yours. You're very, very welcome.
Thank you very much, Comrade. First of all, I would like to express my deep thanks and gratitude to the editorial board of Liberation for organizing and inviting me to address this event. Liberation is a journal which stood in support of the struggle of the Sudanese people and is again providing us with the opportunity to reflect on the recent political developments in our country. Our thanks also go to all personalities and organizations involved in this important gathering, with a special thanks to the anti-war coalition, British anti-war coalition. However, the most important thing, as far as the war in the Sudan, which started on the 15th of April last year is that both the generals of the Security Committee, leaders who are leaders of the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Force militia, are both of them belong to the former regime led by the former president who was deposed in April in 2019. The generals and the RSF leaders have been engaged in a bitter and catastrophic war. Both sides are accused of committing grave crimes, including ethnically motivated killing, detention, torture, rape, actual and sexual violence. The Sudanese Armed Forces is accused of the indiscriminate bombardment of civilian areas in Khartoum, Nihala, as well as other cities, which has killed hundreds of innocent civilians. Meanwhile, the RSF militia continue to commit heinous crimes that include the forced occupation of civilian homes, murder, stealing of property, and rape. Suffice to say that both sides have committed crimes against humanity, not only in the capital and Al Jazeera region, but also in Darfur and Kordofan. As the chairman has stated, that over 15,000 from Masalit African Islamic group have been murdered by the RSF militia in Jinena, capital of West Darfur. It is estimated that over 20,000 civilians have lost their lives in Sudan since the 15th of April last year, and more than 7.7 million people have displaced, both inside and outside the country. A report by the United Nations last Friday says that the migrant within the Sudan and outside Sudan exceeded 9 million. One of each 8 migrants in the world is a Sudanese. And this is a real danger as far as the Sudanese people are facing right now. The sufferings of the Sudanese people continue while both international and regional organizations stand by and look on. The shy statement of condemnation uttered by their officials do nothing to stop the atrocities. Both Jeddah and the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, the IGAD, talks led to nothing. In fact, foreign intervention and support for the various fighting factions is increasing. Recently, the de facto authorities in Port Sudan, that is the government backed by the Security Committee of al-Bashir, has renewed diplomatic relations with the regime in Iran. Turkey, the governments of Turkey and Iran are replacing the government of Egypt in supporting the Rapid Support Forces, supporting the Sudanese Armed Forces generals, while the United Arab Emirates and Russia, via Wagner military group, continue to back the RSF militia. Actually, without such support and direct intervention, the war would have ended during the first few months. The brutality of the war is coupled by direct actions by both sides trying to curtail the rights and the movement of the people. Initiatives by the emergency committees and resistance committees to help reduce the suffering of the people in the capital and other cities under the control of both either the Sudan Armed Forces or the RSF are being met with detention, torture, and even murder. The de facto governments of both sides are maintaining their power and authority through the barrel of the gun. Hundreds of activists are in prisons, and scores of active members of the resistance committees have been disappeared. The international and regional players are dragging their feet, looking to secure their interests in Sudan and make sure they create a civilian fora and organization to facilitate the creation of a new political bloc, as happened in Addis last year. It is imperative that the Rebel Support Force militia, as well as the Sudan Armed Forces generals, be prevented from assuming any future political role, and that the leaderships of both sides be pursued and held accountable for the crimes they perpetrated continuously during the past years. The democratic, patriotic, and revolutionary forces, including the Sudanese Communist Party, demand that the RSF militia and other militias in Sudan be demobilized and disbanded, and that the armed forces should go back to barracks. In the
Comrade, I'm sorry to interrupt. Your video feed has gone down. We just wanted to check whether you're able to open it up again. I'm very sorry to interrupt you. It was just to see if it's possible to get the video back on.
Oh, sorry.
Excellent, thank you. Please do continue.
In the face of the failure and paralysis of the regional efforts to reach durable ceasefire, it is imperative that new ideas and new forces be proposed and advanced to alleviate the sufferings of the people and stop the war. That can be achieved through gaining and representing the majority of the people in international and regional fora. The democratic and patriotic forces comprising the resistance committees, the emerging trade unions, civil society organizations, and political parties are working together to establish from the grassroots the basis for a broad people's front, which would represent the Sudan internally as well as in international forum. This is a basic goal for all the democratic forces in the Sudan right now. Following the attaining of a durable ceasefire, a civilian authority be established to express and oversee safe corridors for the smooth handling of humanitarian aid to reach those in need, as well as to facilitate the safe return of those forces who left their homes, cities, and villages, to restore the role of the state, to establish independent judiciary, to draw a new constitution, to achieve peace in all regions of the country, to guarantee women's representation at all levels, and defend and secure Sudan's national sovereignty and control over the country's natural resources. Stopping the war and regaining the revolution can only be reached through the mass mobilization and securing their active and unfettered participation in all decision-making institutions. It's through arduous struggle, the Sudanese people organizing the masses to prepare and realize general political strife and campaigns of civil disobedience, and with the support and solidarity of the international democratic and progressive forces, that democracy, peace, and social justice would be reached and prevail in Sudan. We appeal to all the democratic and international forces, and especially to the British trade unions and democratic forces inside Britain, to help and call for immediate ceasefire and the creation of safe humanitarian corridors, to campaign for increased delivery of humanitarian assistance with international organizations and remaining directly responsible for the provision and delivery, to assist and protect internally displaced people and those who sought refuge in neighboring countries. Political and public pressure on both on governments of the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, Iran, and Russia to stop interfering and supporting the fighting factions, to contact the International Federation of Journalists to intervene for the release of journalists, including the editor of El Maidan organ, to establish contact between British and Sudanese trade unions, especially doctors, teachers, and journalists, to request assistance of the TUC and other European trade unions to support the participation of the Sudanese trade unions in the ILO conferences, to help and assist with equipment and medicine to no hospital in Burman, the only hospital available to serve the people in one of the cities of the capital of Sudan. These are the concrete things we put forward before the panel. We hope that while intervening and answering some of the questions, we can add to the requests being made. Anyway, once again, we thank very much the Editorial Board of Liberation, the British Coalition Against War, and all the participants in this important gathering. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And so much there that's absolutely crucial for us to understand in terms of the support that we need to give crucially at this point to those struggling for peace in Sudan, to stop the war and to regain the revolution. And certainly it's a key challenge for the trade union movement here in Britain to take up those demands that you've outlined there and to ensure that we stand in full solidarity with you in that struggle. And in terms of building that solidarity against war, I'm really, really pleased to introduce our second speaker now. Lindsey German is a long-time prominent activist and author and convener of the Stop the War Coalition, who's consistently opposed UK involvement in military aggression in wars overseas. She's one of the founder members of the Stop the War Coalition, which was originally established to campaign against the impending war in Afghanistan as part of the so-called war on terror. But Stop the War Coalition has gone on since to organise and play a leading part in opposing British imperialist military intervention right across the world and to mobilise the support of trade unions and mass numbers of campaigners out in the streets against those wars. Lindsey, you are really, really welcome, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Gawain. It's a real honour to be here. I'm very, very pleased to be here for a number of reasons. Firstly, I'd like to thank Liberation for organising this event. I have to say the first political event I ever went to was a Movement for Colonial Freedom concert at the Festival Hall, which was back a long, long time ago now. And that was one of the things that made me more aware of politics and of the role of colonialism in the world. So it's a great pleasure to be here. It's also a great pleasure to hear Fathi speak. That was it's really good to be able to hear what you have to say and the questions that you want us to raise here. And just finally, I'd like to pay tribute to the resistance of the Sudanese people, which has been phenomenal when you think of the resistance committees, when you think of the emergency committees, when you think of this kind of movement, which has been absolutely proudly opposing the military coup, but also this civil war, which has now raged for nearly a year. So I think for us in Britain, we can't really imagine the challenges that these things throw up, and I think it's our duty as campaigners, as socialists, as people who care about what goes on around the world. We live in the oldest imperialist country, I suppose, and which still plays a very, very major role in imperialist conflict around the world. So these are some of the questions I want to address briefly in my contribution tonight. You know, we've seen tens of thousands of people taken to the streets in Sudan against the military, against the civil war. We've also seen the horrific figures that have already been referred to, the number of people killed, the number of people displaced, and the levels of torture, detention, and particularly I think it is worth referring to again the levels of sexual violence, which means that it's extremely difficult, obviously, for women who are campaigning over these things to operate openly and to operate safely. So I think that's a particular, you know, we hear a great deal about, you know, wars for women's rights, as we were told in Afghanistan. But when women are facing these huge attacks on their basic rights, one of the worst possible things that can happen to them, and it's in order to intimidate them and to stop them from organizing, we hear very little coming from the Western governments or from people who say that they care about these things very, very much. So I think that's all of that we need to take into account, and we need to say this is one of the worst humanitarian disasters in the world. Now, unfortunately, these humanitarian disasters, and we can point to a number around the world. We had the recent war in Yemen, where Britain was complicit in the bombing of Yemen by Saudi Arabia. That again led to famine and to terrible humanitarian disaster. We can see what's going on in Gaza at the moment, and I'll refer to that a little bit later on. But the humanitarian disasters, firstly, are very often treated simply at best as a kind of charity question rather than a political question. So can you donate to the disasters fund? Can you do these kind of things without looking at why they happen and without looking at the complicity of our governments? And therefore, for me, humanitarian disasters, of course, there are reasons why you have humanitarian disasters, but there are also reasons why they are not dealt with in a way that we would expect them to be dealt with, that they're not dealt with in terms of giving sufficient aid or in terms of stopping them in the first place. And I think when we talk about what's going on in Sudan, we have to talk not just about a man-made, not just about a humanitarian disaster, but these are man-made disasters. They're created by the military, they're created by groups like the RSF, they're created by these people, but these people, as has been said, are backed by various powers around the world, or armed by various powers, because people have different interests in what they want to get out, either political control of particular areas of the world or economic control. The Africa, after all, has a history second to none, both of imperialist aggression in order to get hold of the resources of the countries of Africa, but also a history of resistance and opposition to that imperialism. And I think we need to look at some of these things in that kind of context. We often hear reference in our media and from our politicians about the international rules-based order that supposedly exists in the world today. And I have to say that, as Mahatma Gandhi said about when he was asked, what do you think of Western civilization? And he said, it would be a very good idea. I feel the same could be said about an international rules-based order, because we don't have such a thing. We have a disorder around the world, which is often created and perpetrated by Western imperialism in particular, but by other forces as well. And it's this that I think we have to we have to address as much as we can. And while we look at the specifics over Sudan, I also think we need to look at the wider questions. We need to look at the wider questions about why it is that we have chaos in the Middle East, that we have a potential genocide, if not an actual genocide, going on in Gaza at the moment, that we have the West backing Israel to the hilt. We have a situation where we're told all the time about Iran-backed militias in Iraq, or Iran-backed Houthis in Yemen, or Iran-backed Hezbollah in Lebanon. We never hear about US-backed Israel or US-backed Saudi Arabia or any of these other countries, because there's a very definite set of double standards going on here, and we see that all the time. And I think these are questions that we need to address as well. So I think partly we have to locate many of the conflicts of the world, and I would include Sudan in this, in a wider imperialist context and in a wider global capital, which has done so much damage to the peoples of the world, to so many of the peoples of the world who are suffering as the people in Sudan are. And it's very difficult, obviously, for the resistance to the military and to the civil war to operate openly at the moment. And they do as much as they possibly can. But these things, they face repression, and people face repression in other parts of the world as well. What can we do as an anti-war movement here in Britain? Well, I think there's a number of things. Obviously, Fathi has made a number of points that he wants us to take up, and I'm very, very happy to take those up and to discuss them and to publicize them. I think the first thing is getting the information out there. You know, the way it is portrayed in Britain is always, you know, that there's these bunch of people in Africa. There's one side, they're always fighting each other. Why do they do that? Well, it's incomprehensible. And aren't we lucky that we all live in such a civilized country that doesn't do these kind of things, without any sense of the complicity of Britain and of the United States, without any sense of the wider issues here. So I think the first thing is beginning to spell out these sorts of things. The second thing is to make that information real, in real terms, with protests. Now, this is difficult because we know, and I know that for people in Sudan, they must see the protests over Gaza and Israel and think, why can't we get protests in Britain about those kind of things? And it isn't always easy to do for a whole range of reasons that I haven't got time to go into. What is possible to do, though, is to try to link up these issues and to say, the solidarity with Gaza also means solidarity with Sudan, also means solidarity with the Yemenis, and also means solidarity with different countries, and that we are facing the same struggle. Of course, they have different specifics, but it is very important that we try to link them up. So I think trying to bring the question of Sudan into the wider movement is very important, and it's been talked about in terms of trade unions and in terms of how we can get deeper involvement in the trade unions. We've got trade union conferences coming up, and we should think about how can we get Sudan on the agenda, if not on the agenda of the actual conference, but on the agenda of having meetings around it, of having information around it, of doing all those sorts of things, and of committing trade unions to supporting the demand for an end to the war, for a ceasefire, for all those things that are so important to them. And then I would also like to say that these wars are very often a product of neoliberal capitalism and the competition between capital and the different countries that want to have some sort of stake in the raw materials in Africa and so on. But I would also like to say that for us, for those of us who are campaigners and those of us who want to bring democracy and justice and freedom around the world, then we have to think about how more widely we link these up with the global protests that go on, you know, which are frequent, which we do have people protesting across the world against the effects of neoliberalism. Most recently, the general strike in Argentina against the far-right president there. We do have the protests in a whole number of countries, big protests in Germany against the growth of the far right. Let's think about the ways that we can link these different issues up, because we're fighting for a different world. We're not just fighting for justice in any particular country, vital though that is. We also have to draw the links between them so people begin to see this is the struggle over Sudan is part of our struggle, it's part of what we do in Britain. So just to conclude there, Gawain, by saying, you know, I think we have to begin to look at it in this kind of way and stop the war coalition. We will do everything we can to help to build a movement for the ceasefire in Sudan. And we're very, very pleased to be involved in this webinar tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lindsey. And some absolutely crucial points there, I think, about how whilst we are building that solidarity with the people calling for peace in Sudan and to win that ceasefire there, we must also link that to all of the other issues we face, both those other international issues where we are fighting for a ceasefire in Palestine, to end US-UK involvement in the attacks on Yemen, etc., but also to the issues that we face at home and making those links direct, because it is all part of one interconnected system within which this takes place. And the importance, I would say, from the perspective of the General Federation of Trade Unions, the importance of the trade union movement being a part of that struggle and lending its solidarity is absolutely crucial. Well, thank you to the two panelists we've had so far. This is the point where we would really, really like to have your questions, your thoughts, your comments, and to get a bit of dialogue and a bit of back and forth between yourselves and the panelists we've got today. So again, I'll remind you, at the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A box. If you go into there, you're able to both pose questions to our panel or to make comments on things that they've said. And I'll put those to the panelists. So I'm going to start, if that's okay, by bringing up a comment that's been posted in the chat right near the beginning of the conversation, where someone, Ahmed Wilinque, has commented, for keeping international peace and security, is it not high time that the international community holds UAE accountable for fueling the commission of the heinous crimes by supplying arms to the RSF? And if I were to widen that question a little bit more before I ask the panelists to come back, in fact, what links do we need to be looking at internationally? Who is outside of Sudan supporting and inflaming this conflict? And how can we tackle them? Lindsey, I know you've touched on this a little bit in terms of talk about what we can do around our own government, but I don't know if you've got any further wider comments on that. And then when you've had an opportunity to come back, I'm going to bring in our next panelist. So Lindsey, over to you first.
And that question was about the UAE and the supplying of arms to the RSF. Was that right, Gawain? Sorry, I was just writing something down. Yeah.
Yes, it was about UAE, but also I broadened it a little and said more widely, you know, who else is involved here and what can we do to put pressure on?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's an absolutely fair question. I mean, the UAE was also involved in supplying arms in the war in Yemen, and I mean, this is a major feature now. It's one of the big problems in Britain, because Britain relies increasingly on arms sales to as part of its GDP, and you know, we're selling these arms to all sorts of people. But yeah, it's a problem that there are people in different countries, like Russia is supplying arms, UAE is supplying arms, but of course there's arms going to the other side as well. So you get this. I mean, it's a terrifying development if you look at the amount of arms sales and the amount of arms production, and it's going up dramatically in a whole number of countries. There are, in the richer countries, they're all, if you take, for example, Germany and Japan, are both doubling their their military budget. They're all prepared to sell arms to countries where there is conflict and where there is division. And of course, we know that the people who suffer most from these are the ordinary people of those countries who are at risk of, and much of the repression, of course, is used against these countries' own people. And that is what's going on in Sudan. So I think we have to be very, very strongly against this and be prepared to take action against people who are supplying arms. But of course, again, this is very one-sided. So, you know, there's sanctions on all sorts of countries imposed by the United States, but the UAE isn't one of them because it's an ally of the United States. So these are some of the big questions I think we are facing.
Thanks very much, Lindsey. And as you say, it's instructive, isn't it, to look at where sanctions are and aren't applied by leading imperialist countries like our own. It tells us an awful lot about whether those judgments are truly about human rights and peace, or in fact more about the view that they wish to impose on the world. Anyway, at this point, before we take any more questions, I would like to bring in our third panelist. So you've heard already from Fathi about the situation in Sudan directly. You've heard from Lindsey German about the role that we can play in opposing this and linking it to those other international issues and the campaign for peace and against imperialism. And the third speaker I would like to introduce today is Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy is a member of Parliament, a former leader of the Labour Party, but possibly more importantly, dare I say it, a long-term anti-imperialist and pro-peace campaigner, a vice president of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament for a long time, an officer of the Stop the War Coalition and joint president of Liberation. Jeremy has a fantastic record of standing up against imperialist oppression and standing up for peace right across the world. Jeremy, you are very, very welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Gawain. I'll be very brief so we can get on with the questions and discussion. And I've just come on now because I've just come from the House of Commons chamber where we were once again questioning the government about the Middle East and about Gaza and the ICJ judgment and why they're cutting funding from the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. And the campaign of solidarity with the people of Palestine continues with a big demonstration planned this weekend and a workplace demonstrations next week, which is also very, very important to grow the campaign in solidarity with the people of Palestine. In my question, I asked why the government hadn't supported the South African application to the International Court of Justice, and then specifically asked them if they will, in the light of the ICJ decision, desist from all military aid to Israel. And I'm still waiting for the answer for that one. I suspect I might have quite a long wait for an answer to that one. But the interest by so many people is utterly extraordinary. The point for this meeting is that wars are never restricted to just one venue and one place. And the bombing of Gaza by Israel and the attacks on people on the West Bank and the continued awful living of the refugees in many countries is now extending into Lebanon. It's extending into the militarization of the Mediterranean and is extending into the bombing of Yemen. And so these wars spread. And the situation in Sudan, where today there's a huge clash between South Sudan and Sudanese forces. It's unclear to me which Sudanese forces were involved in this clash, but many have died as a result. And the continuing internal conflict in Sudan. Well, the only winners in this are the arms dealers, and the other winners in this are those that want to exploit the natural resources of Sudan. So what I'd be interested to hear from others on the panel particularly is what possibility there is of an insertion of a democratic popular demand from the people of Sudan as to their own future, rather than the future being decided by opposing military factions who are obviously being well funded from various places in order to carry on with this ghastly conflict, the losers of which, of course, are the Sudanese people. And we've seen in other countries across the region, when there is a military conflict between various factions in each country, the end civil government more or less collapses. The winners in this are those that want to exploit the mineral and other resources of the country for their own strategic interests. And so those are the areas that I'd be interested to hear what our friends in Sudan have to say on this. Just finally, we have to achieve peace. The losers in this are always the poorest and most vulnerable people. The winners in this are those that make the money out of arms sales and minerals.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, and absolutely crucial questions to be asking there. I completely agree. The questions around who actually seeks to gain from this, as you said, the arms dealers and those who seek to exploit Sudan's resources, but how can we counterpose to that the democratic voice of the Sudanese people, the progressive demands that they themselves have put forward? We're really sorry we've temporarily lost the connection with Fathi in Sudan for a moment. We hope to be bringing him back in just another moment. But while we wait to do that and to put some of those questions to him, speaking on behalf of the movement in Sudan, I'm going to read some more questions out from the chat and put them to Lindsey and to Jeremy while we try and re-establish that connection. The next question I would like to raise here relates to news that is just out now. Is breaking news from the International Criminal Court, where the prosecutor is now saying that it looks highly likely that both the Sudanese armed forces and the RSF are potentially committing war crimes in Darfur. And the question that's been raised in the chat here is how much can the role of working on the legal aspects of this help, and what's the possible action on this level? I guess whether that is through the International Criminal Court or through other international ventures. To what extent can international legal routes help in stopping what's going on here, particularly if evidence of war crimes is found? So while we wait to re-establish that connection, I'm just going to throw that question out to Lindsey and to Jeremy. I don't know which of you would like to come in first there.
Jeremy, do you want to?
Actually, it's the first I'd heard of that decision today, but it's quite interesting that the ICC should be looking at both parties in this conflict. How they are going to take it forward, I'm really not sure. But it kind of underlines the point that the conflict is one that is obviously taking an awful lot of life and causing an awful lot of destruction. And what I'd be interested to hear from is the voice of the Sudanese people, because the Western media seem to have completely forgotten them or discussed them in any way on this. But I'm not really up to speed on what the ICC decision today was. The first I've heard of it.
I mean, can I just add to that? I hadn't heard of it today either. And it seems, I mean, I guess that there's a little bit more kind of thinking about this as a result of the South African case going to the International Court of Justice over Israel, which whatever you felt the total outcome was clearly a defeat for Israel in all sorts of ways. Now, as Jeremy says, I think it's interesting they're talking about both sides, and I think that obviously we'd agree that both sides are committing war crimes. I mean, the things that have been listed so far would make that fairly clear, I think. But my concern always, I mean, I think obviously legal action can highlight the case, is very important. In the South African case, I think it was extremely important to get that legal judgment. But as we all know, you've got a very long process going on here. You've also got a process where you don't necessarily, it doesn't mean that people are going to stop what they're doing. It means that you might be able to theoretically bring them to justice in some years' time. So it doesn't create an immediate relief for the people of Sudan. And also the history of the ICC is that, certain people who are accused of war crimes end up there and occasionally get imprisoned as a result of it. But the truth is that some of the major perpetrators of encouraging some of this stuff don't. And so there's a political question there as well. And it seems to me we have to look at it in that way. So fair enough that this has happened. It shows that there's concern about how bad the situation is in Sudan, but it won't quickly bring us towards any kind of ceasefire or resolution, let alone advances for the people of Sudan who are so suffering.
Absolutely, and I think across both of those comments and from Jeremy's contribution a moment ago, there is a crucial point there, isn't it? In spite of the fact that legal avenues, international legal avenues, can be used as a tactic, and that the link there has been posted into the chat to try and hold people accountable for these. In fact, it is when we raise the voice of the Sudanese people themselves, it's when we bring them into the discussion that things really start to shift. And as you say, international legal action can take a considerable amount of time, but the fact is that we need to change the situation on the ground now and make sure that the voice of those people is listened to, and that we're doing everything we can to ensure that it's raised, which is why it was so important to hold this meeting this evening, and why it's so important to have the voice of the Sudanese movement at the meeting's end. We hope to have Comrade Fathi back on the call very shortly. In the meantime, I would re-emphasize the importance of building awareness around this, and for those who've joined today, to make sure that your local trade union branch, your local organizations are affiliated to the Stop the War Coalition, to Liberation, are involved in this discussion and are involved in the campaign to ensure both that our voices are raised for peace in Palestine, in Yemen, and in Sudan, but also that we help to raise the voice of the Sudanese people. And while we're waiting to remake that connection, another question for consideration from the chat here. How do we stop Chatham House from interfering in Sudanese policymaking with a small group of Sudanese who are themselves considered as traitors, in my opinion, because they try to implement colonial policies and choose upon themselves to govern the Sudanese people? That's a question from Salwa El Said. This wouldn't be the only situation we've seen internationally, would it? I can think of several others where, once again, Western countries, our own included, are very keen to suppress the voice of the real movement on the ground in countries like Sudan, but where a small select of people pushing a certain agenda which fits with the agenda of those imperialist countries are presented as somehow speaking on behalf of the people. What can we do about that, and how can we challenge our government and our state on those questions, Jeremy?
Well, the colonial mentality is never far away, as I'm sure Lindsey will agree. And I was in the Commons chamber, as I was saying earlier, And one point that Andrew Mitchell made, who's the minister responsible for the Foreign Office in the Commons, was that there had to be a new government in Gaza. It had to be one that was approved of by the international community. I'm not quite sure how you define international community, but that's what he said. And that Hamas had to go, and that Israel must also be content with the situation. So basically, it is the countries that have all supported Israel in this, saying they will decide what the future government of Gaza is. And that is an example of the colonial mentality. And Chatham House has a whole record of this kind of intensive discussions that they have, and then try and maneuver people into positions to run the show there. In reality, it's the people of Sudan that have got to be able to decide their future. But if you've got a war going on and arms flowing in, then the people that are going to control the situation are those that have got the most weapons, and they won't be particularly concerned about the state of the people there. And so I think we have to be very careful about the power of Western think tanks that are incorporated into decision making by foreign offices, not just British, but other foreign ministries, and the enormous amount of money that is put into some of these think tanks by huge vested interests. BAE Systems, for example, BP, and a number of others are very happy to fund these kind of organizations and give a quasi-independence to foreign policy thinking. The reality is they turn those organizations into mouthpieces of the what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. I was talking to my friend Phyllis Bennis yesterday from the United States, and her pressure for independent thinking on foreign policy is absolutely huge. But her organization, compared to all the other think tanks that surround the Beltway in Washington, are all incredibly well funded. Hers is one that's coming up with genuine arguments for peace, and she's well known for a long time as a good friend of the Stop the War Coalition. Over to you, Lindsey.
Yeah, just to add to what Jeremy said, which I totally agree with. I think that, Chatham House is another example of, if you like, British soft power, that you get these supposedly impartial think tanks. They're not. They're connected to the British government and the British establishment, and they, as the questioner says, interfere in a whole number of places, including in Sudan. And of course, they'll use people in Sudan because there'll be Sudanese people who have very different views on these things, and they'll use people who agree with the Western agenda to do so. And I think it's something that we have to be very much opposed to. I think that national self-determination should be something that is very important to us. And just on the Gaza question, as Jeremy said, I mean, what the British government, Lord David Cameron, the failed prime minister who's now the unelected foreign secretary, he wants a technocratic government in Gaza. This is the Gaza Strip, which has been completely pulverized from one end to the other by Israeli bombs, and they're going to put a technocratic government. In other words, the last people who are going to decide what happens in Gaza are the Palestinians. It won't be them who decide it. So yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. This is going on all over the world in different degrees, but it is going on with so-called experts trying to influence political decisions in various countries, and including in Sudan, and that's basically a colonial project.
No? Absolutely, Lindsey. And an interesting fact that's just been posted by one of our participants today in the chat, that actually of the arms that Britain sold to Sudan between 2012 and 2022, 80% of them were sold in 2022 after the coup that took place in October 21. We need to constantly be holding our government to account for its involvement in provoking and developing these, whether that's by diplomatic means, whether that's by military means, direct military means, or whether that's by this kind of support and arms sales. Anyway, I'm really pleased to welcome Comrade Fathi back into the chat. It was a real shame that we lost the link for a moment there, but we've been discussing the role that external powers, including our own government, have played in inflaming and provoking the conflict in Sudan, and the importance of raising the voice of the Sudanese people and the clear demands of the movement in Sudan in opposition to those voices that are raised by Western imperialist countries. So I would just like, Comrade Fathi, if it's okay to put the question to you: how do we challenge those imperialist countries who are trying to put their own stamp, their own imprint on what a solution looks like in Sudan, and how do we raise the voices of the movement in Sudan, of the progressive forces and the forces fighting for peace in Sudan? What can we do to raise those voices? Comrade Fathi.
Thank you very much for having me on for the question. Basically, the difference which is existing between what the international and regional forces are, or players are trying to impose in the Sudan as a solution to the crisis in Sudan, is that we have to try to stop foreign intervention and support rendered to the two sides. That means the basic fair demand is to stop intervention and interference and support to the two fighting factions. I think this is of top priority. As we have stated in our intervention, is that there are some countries, local regional forces in Turkey, United Arab Emirates, Iran, or also Russia, and so on. They are interfering in the internal affairs in the Sudan. And we think there is a big possibility, in case these interventions and this support they are rendering to the two fighting sections are being disclosed and exposed, this would lead at least unmasking the real forces behind the war in the Sudan. The fight in the Sudan is about the natural resources we have and the geographical, geopolitical importance of the Sudan. It is the Red Sea, it is the Sudan having different frontiers with, I don't know, 5, 6 African countries. And partly, this is one of the reasons in the recent period, in the recent years, foreign intervention in the Sudan became more clear. 1. 2, because of the weakness of the Muslim Brotherhood regime in the country, it tried to play the game between, let's say, Russia, the United States, and so on and so forth, and trying to have both of them collide and just to protect the regime. So foreign intervention should be stopped. This is the first step. As far as the internal question is concerned, our position is very clear that any force which would attempt to represent Sudan should be based inside the country, that the building of representation for the Sudanese people should start from the basis inside the country. And this is what we are trying, maybe since the war, even before the war. However, after the war, and I think in the last 2-3 months, major steps were taken. For example, building a kind of a relationship and a strong bond between the resistance committees and the trade union movement, represented by the doctors, by the teachers, and by the journalists. This is a step forward. About a month and a half ago, a meeting took place between the Sudanese Communist Party and the representatives of the resistance movement. And we consider that as a big step in the right direction, because the discussion concentrated on issues which are part of the two programs, and a kind of an understanding and agreement was reached about the common ground between what is in their program and in the program of the Sudanese Communist Party. At the same time, what is going on now, that the forces for radical change, which comprises different political parties as well as organizers, have taken steps toward joining efforts with the building of this very broad People's Front, but from the basis. And from the basis, it goes up till it reaches and forms the real representation of the people of the Sudan. And if we have a united democratic front representing the civil society in the Sudan and calling for a civil and democratic rule, a complete civil and democratic rule, I think this is the direction through which the war can be stopped in the country. Mind you, this is not the first time that the Sudanese peoples are facing reactionary dictatorships in the country and military dictatorship in the country. However, this is the first time that the militaries are using force against each other, which in a sense they are weakening each other. But both of them, and this is the point, both of them are targeting the resistance community, I mean the people's movement. And this is where, if we can get international support and international solidarity with the struggle, because there is resistance in the country. I mean, this is the fact. There is resistance in the country. And that's why a number of cadres of the resistance movement and even of the other forces are being imprisoned and harassed, be it by the military intelligence or the rapid support force. So if we can build this international solidarity, if we can fetter the hands of the aggressors inside the Sudan, I think this is the way through which the mass democratic movement in Sudan can impose its will. It happened in 1964, it happened in 1985, it happened even this century. When the revolution in Sudan did not enjoy at all the support of the governments, be it regional or international, because it jeopardized and endangered the interest of these governments in the country. Imperialism, US imperialism, Russian regime, even China. From the international side. On the other hand, it challenges the agreement reached between the Muslim Brotherhood country and the Gulf states of selling our land to these people. It challenged the interests of Wagner Group and the support they render to the rapid support force, not only in the smuggling of gold and natural resources of the Sudan, no, not only that, but even the tactics, the war in the cities. I think this is a tactic and trained by the Wagner Group. So if we can expose all these and help to expose all these problems, I think a better understanding of the struggle in Sudan would take place, and at the same time, this would be a great help to push our cause abroad. What we are capable of doing, and this we have done 3 times. I mean, the Sudanese mass actions toppled down dictatorship in 1964, in 1985, and even in 2019. And this is a fact. This is a fact. 4 years ago, it is through the mass movement and against, not against the Muslim Brotherhood or the local reactionary forces, but even against the wishes and intentions of our neighbors and the international imperialist forces. So I think the democratic forces in the Sudan are capable. What we are missing now is how to check foreign intervention in the country. And if we can reach that, if this is so much exposed, I think the Sudanese people, the democratic forces, the front and the alliances we have built and the rich experience accumulated by the democratic forces in Sudan would definitely push the struggle of the Sudanese people towards success for peace, for democracy, and for social justice. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. And we've got lots of questions in the chat asking about what we can do, but I think you've answered really, really clearly there. It is about building that solidarity with the progressive, the democratic forces in Sudan, and making sure that we use that to restrict the room for maneuver for those forces that would oppress and oppose them. And that's a crucial task, I think, for all of us to take on. And maybe in the discussion, we can talk a bit more about how working with the trade union movement, with Liberation, with the Stop the War Coalition, we can start to build those solidarity links, linking, as Lindsey said earlier, to the other issues that have already mobilized people around international questions, but to make those links across to Sudan and to start to build and strengthen that solidarity. There are a few more questions in the chat here that I'd like to put around the connections between imperialist powers and the international situation and Sudan itself. So there are three questions that I'd like to put together as a set here. The first one's from an anonymous attendee, and it says, can Comrade Fathi explain what is meant by the soft landing project that is supported by the US and its allies in Sudan? Which Sudanese political forces are backed by the United States? The second question, posed again by another anonymous contributor in the chat, asks, what is the Israeli connection in Sudan and the ongoing conflict? We know that Sudan's military rulers joined the normalization process backed by the US, but what's the connection there? And then the third question, and this is from Liz Payne from the Communist Party of Britain, an urgent question for those present. Some civilian forces in Sudan are arguing for compromise deals with military forces going forward. How can we in Britain best support the democratic forces in Sudan who completely reject any deal with the military whatsoever and any role for the military in the future government of a democratic Sudan? Comrade Fathi, again, if I can come directly to you with those questions, and then we'll have another set of questions for the whole panel following that.
Thank you, Comrade. Thank you very much. Anyway, as far as the first question is concerned, the soft landing project was started, I think, around 2010 by the committee of experts, or whatever they are called, in the United States. And the main aim of the soft landing project was that during that period, I mean, 2010, it became clear to the international community, it seems, and it was much clearer to us in the Sudan, that the regime is reaching its end. So what the soft landing project was aiming at is to try to enlarge the social base of the regime by adding to it some political parties or some political forces to join the regime. At that time, I remember very well, the European Union had sent a representative to the Sudan and trying to see how far such a project can be successful. A lot of parties spoke about the possibility of joining hands with the regime. The UMA party, the Congress party, they spoke about participation in elections and so on and so forth. The only party which clearly identified itself and said no to the joining hands with or trying to find a common ground with the Muslim Brotherhood regime was the Sudanese Communist Party at that time. However, the uprising which took place in 2013 in the Sudan, and after which some of these hesitating forces tried to build together a united front, and it was joined also by all these two parties which I have mentioned, and the Sudanese Communist Party, the Ba'ath Party, and so on. And they sent a delegation to Europe to try to convince them to support the struggle against the regime and the replacement of the regime. They met with the European Union, they met with and there was a meeting in Germany, and they were told openly that not a single penny of support would be rendered to the democratic forces in the Sudan to topple the regime, but these forces are supposed to follow the roadmap proposed by Mbeki at that time. And the roadmap exactly was the project of the soft landing to join hands with the remnants of the regime. And here, again, there was a split in the opposition. Two parties went ahead with the recommendation of the European Union and Germany in particular. Others created the national national unanimity organization. And here again, there is a split within the opposition. After that, and this is the point, when it became clear in 2018, with the uprising going on in different parts of the Sudan, again, there was this kind of attempts to unify the opposition. And it's still, I must enter, I mean, while the forces of national consensus created by different political parties were leading the movement, the two parties, the Congress Party as well as the Ummah Party, spoke very openly that they are preparing to join hands with the project, to implement the project. Some of them even spoke about participation in elections in 2020 with for al-Bashir for a second term or a third term, I don't remember. But when the uprising started, and this is it, and it started outside the capital, and this will show that how the consciousness of the people in the Sudan came. It came from outside the capital for the first time. And it started in Namazin, in Atbara, and so on and so forth. And towards the end of 2018, a number of political parties started again to speak about unity and so on, and they formed the Forces for Freedom and Change. However, the main party, the Ummah Party, did not join this coalition only after, I think, 2019, just before the success of toppling the head of state in April 2019. What I'm trying to say is that the project is still there. Maybe the name of it is changed, but the project itself, I mean, the aim to create a common ground between the opposition and the remnants of the regime is there. It is being spelled in a different way, maybe the consensus, the roadmap, which was agreed in end of I think end of 2020, 22 or early 23, and these projects are going on, and I think that the Addis agreement between Hemeti and the new force, this Taqaddum, also is part and parcel of the soft landing project. I mean, a kind of a compromise which will repeat the existence of the crisis which the Sudan has been facing since independence. This is it. As far as the Israeli connection, it became abundantly clear after even during the heydays of the revolution and during the transitional government led by Dr. Hamdok, and during the Trump presidency, the idea of normalization of relation, or Abraham project again, that Sudan should be part of it. Even the president of the state met Netanyahu in I think in Uganda, in Kampala or Entebbe, and agreed about that behind the back of the civilian government. Not only that, but even the army as well as the rapid support forces maintain relations with the Israeli government. And today, for example, and even with Hamas and so on, the Muslim Brotherhood in the Sudan, as well as the rapid support forces, are having kind of relation and dialogue and relations with Israel. And this is very clear. Concerning civilian government, yes, there are certain forces in the Sudan, civilian forces and political parties, who think that stopping the war can be isolated from regaining the revolution. I mean, what they just want to go back to the situation before April 15th, 2023. But they forget the reality that going back, that means to that area, going back to before April, it means the existence of the same regime which led to the crisis. I mean, because what is going on, or what was going on at that time, it was not the roadmap or what they have agreed there, but the difference was who would control the authority, the state power, who would control the natural resources of the Sudan. And it was a struggle for power as well as wealth of the country. And this is what is going on now. I mean, okay, these are the two phases, the army generals and the leadership of the RSF. Yeah, but who is behind them? And who maintains the war in the Sudan? They don't have the ability or the financial or otherwise clout that they continue a war for 10 months. I mean, we should be very clear about that. So the only support we expect from the democratic forces the world over, progressive forces the world over, is to support the forces inside the country to build the People's Front, who working for a radical change that at least will not take the Sudan back to what had happened before 15th of April. We are not trying to say we throw everything against them. No, what we are trying to say, the way to reach a real change in the Sudan, as we have explained in our intervention, is clearly to have a durable ceasefire. In case of peace, I think this is where the people in the Sudan will triumph. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those answers. There are so many questions in the chat, and my apologies to all those whose question won't get heard tonight. I hope that this is not the end, but the beginning of a dialogue and a discussion with those progressive forces in Sudan, so that we can develop further some of the answers to these questions and where the movement goes next. But there's a series of interlinked questions that I'd like to put as a final set to our panel. So if you'll bear with me, I'm going to try and put a few together here, which I think connect with each other in different ways. And then if it's okay, I'm going to ask Lindsey to respond to any of them she wishes to comment on first, and then go back to Comrade Fathi to close with some closing remarks and responses to these questions. So the first one is an anonymous question. And the question is, are there any news sources in Sudan or otherwise which give reliable information about what's happening in Sudan? Where is the best place for us to look for that information? We've then got two questions from Owen McNeill from the Workers' Party of Ireland. And the first of those, I think, links to that question about key news sources in Sudan. And the question is, what's the strength of the progressive forces in Sudan at the moment? The second question from Owen is, would the panel agree that the attempts by the Sudanese people to achieve democracy in Sudan was subverted by the Sudanese military and regional powers that are engaged in competition for influence and resources, which again ties into the themes we've already been discussing? And then the last few questions, this one is from Abdul Malik Lobiad. And the question is, could the conscientious campaigners here confirm if they're willing to meet with the leaders of Sudanese Against War to widen solidarity with people in Sudan? So any comment on that group? There's an anonymous question around the resistance committees. The resistance committees continue to fight for civilian rule and to provide humanitarian assistance after the war, yet they face many challenges, in particular informing about their resistance. There's a lack of media outlets to inform about the struggle of the people, while resistance committees manage to develop a revolutionary charter for people's power. How can liberation, socialists, anti-war movements, trade unions help in supporting media outlet or a hub in order to inform the movement here about the people's resistance? And then finally, a question that I think in some way sums up the majority of questions we've had in the chat here. And this is from Iman El-Katim, and it begins, where do we go from here? Any guidance from your experience, especially from our Sudanese comrades? We all agree that stopping the war and regaining the revolution is the crucial demand. However, how this practically can be achieved from your experience in the light of all these obstacles is what we're interested to know. So in particular, what can we do in the movement here? I'm going to start with Lindsey, if that's okay, and then go to Fathi to respond to those. And those will be the last contributions in this meeting. So Lindsey, over to you first of all.
Thanks very much, Gawain. And thanks to everybody for the contributions and again for inviting me. Now, what I want to do really in this final sort of summing up, there's a number of questions which I'm sure Fathi will be better at, more acquainted with the facts discussing. But I just wanted to say, there's one question about, how can we support the resistance forces, and then there's what's the strength of the progressive forces in Sudan. Now, for us, I think we have to assume that any civil war, any military conflict of the sort that the Sudanese people is going through has an immense effect on people in all sorts of very, very direct and indirect ways. We know from the Sudanese people in this country that it has a huge impact on the community here, seeing what's going on and facing terrible news about their loved ones and so on. So, of course, military force is an absolutely deliberate weapon to repress democratic struggle and to repress socialist struggle and to repress all those kind of things. So, of course, it is having an effect on people. It will have an effect on people. And in those situations, it's sometimes very hard for people to organise. But I think what's clear around the discussion tonight, and what's clear from what we've heard from Fathi and what we've heard from other Sudanese comrades, is that there is a tremendous tradition in Sudan of people challenging the military, which has always been present in the country since independence. There's a tremendous tradition of trying to campaign for democracy and freedom. And I'm sure that is continuing in however limited and underway and in however difficult the circumstances are. So I think that's very important for us to understand. Now, the crucial question is, what solidarity can we show? And just to say, the question, will we meet with the Sudanese Against War organization? Yeah, very happy to, and very happy to get any information that we can from Sudanese comrades about ways in which we can help concretely to improve the situation and to build the campaign for a ceasefire. And as I said earlier, I think we need more kind of cross-fertilization of the different campaigns that are going on in order to do so. But as we've all said, I think one of the issues for us is, how do we make this a much bigger media issue? How do we get it out into the trade union movement? How do we get it so it's something that people, when they hear about it, they know that this is an issue that we have to take up? Now, it seems to me getting the information out is very important. And the truth is that our media, the access we have to media, is limited. Left-wing media is very good, but obviously it doesn't have the same reach as the big national media or the BBC or any of these things. So we can try to get information into those publications, but also we do need to stress that the left media is also very important in terms of getting these ideas across. Trade union movement, I think, is incredibly important, and the anti-war movement, that if we can link up what's happening in Sudan and say, this is not separate from Gaza, it's the same kind of struggle. We're talking about, the region is now in flames, the possibility of major conflict again in Yemen, the possibility of conflict which spreads around the Red Sea is obviously a very immediate threat. So we do need to think about it in those terms. But I just want to end by saying that I also think we need to look at it more widely, that we're faced with a situation where we have a world which is becoming much more dangerous, moving more and more towards conflict and war, of which Sudan is unfortunately a very bad example. How do we link up these different struggles? There are millions, billions of people around the world who are looking for an alternative, who don't want to live under neoliberalism, who certainly don't want war and repression and conflict like so many people in the world have. So how do we begin to spread these different ideas and say, well, what happens in Argentina isn't separate from what we're talking about in Sudan. What's happening in Gaza isn't separate. What's happening with the terrible conflict in India isn't separate. These are all part of the way in which the society is moving in a very bad direction. And, you know, the truth is that we either face a more threatening world, a more dangerous world, or the people of the world, I say that in the broadest sense, the broad, you know, the working class people, people who work on the land, all the different people around the world, unless we organise collectively in solidarity with each other, but also to challenge our governments and to overthrow our governments and to overthrow the systems that they've brought up, then we are going to be in a serious, serious problem. So just to end on that and to say that solidarity very much with Fathi and with the Sudanese people and with the resistance in Sudan, which is very brave and is facing very many challenges. And we will do everything we can to help. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lindsey. And I would echo those comments, the importance of connecting those struggles and of us doing everything that we can to build that solidarity. But for our final words this evening on all of those interlinked issues, I want to pass back now to Fathi El-Fadl. Over to you.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to say very openly, I mean, we agree that you cannot separate what is going on in the Sudan from what is going on in Gaza or even in India or any other place. The most important issue is that imperialism and reactionary forces are on the offensive. And this is a fact we have to recognize. What is happening in the Sudan is part and parcel of that. And I think that what the Sudanese people can do in solidarity with the Palestinian people in Gaza and in the Western Bank for the defeat of the aggression, stop of the war there, and have a ceasefire there, is by concentrating on the struggle inside the Sudan to defeat the de facto governments in the country. We have been experience in the Sudan have shown that despite the three military regimes, the way out was through the mobilization of the people. And this is what we are trying to do right now. The mobilization of the people, rebuilding from the grassroots, the broad People's Front, from where it is possible. I think in a number of cities where there is still relative kind of peace, relative movement, and the nucleus of the broad front is being there. It is there in the resistance committees, in the meetings between the resistance committees and the trade union, in the meeting between the resistance committees and the Sudanese Communist parties, and in the formation and development of the forces for radical change. What is missing is how to make it broad. Well, the question about the strength of the progressive forces. It is very difficult to say the progressive forces are very strong. No, they are not very strong, but the progressive forces, and I think the experience in the Sudan since 1964, 85, and 2019 proves one thing, what seems impossible. And let us be frank, I mean, the revolution in the Sudan, the December revolution in the Sudan did not enjoy at all the support of the regional forces. I mean, the governments, none of the governments came to help the revolution in Sudan. On the contrary, all the regional governments in the area were against the revolution, and all of them tried to stop the march of the Sudanese people. Of course, also the big powers, be it Russia, be it the United States, be it Britain or otherwise. And none of the governments welcome the changes in the Sudan. And that's why the intervention which started early in April through, be it Abiy Ahmed from Ethiopia or from the African Union or their representatives and whatever, and the coalition between these forces and the bourgeois there and the remnants of the regime resulted in the betrayal to the charter of the which was signed by the forces for freedom and change. And since April, after the toppling or removal of the head of state, contradictions started to appear within the coalition, and then a breakaway happened. However, the progressive forces managed, and this is a fact, the progressive forces managed to stop the march of the military. I mean, the coup on October 25th did not manage to reach its result. And this was done by the progressive forces. When we speak about the progressive forces, we don't speak about parties. We speak about mass democratic movement on which the parties, including the Sudanese Communist Party, plays a role. However, the masses, when they are organized, they speak for themselves. And this is where we speak about that independence of the components of the mass democratic movement. And in the front, their independence component would help develop a charter, can develop in the Sudan. It is not, when you speak about the progressive forces, we don't speak about the Sudanese Communist Party. No, we speak about a mass democratic movement. And that historically, this mass democratic movement proved to be the key force to make change. We made change, and we are going to make change. When people spoke about a change in the Sudan in 2018, none of the, even some of our friends were thinking that we are imagining things. But reality came again, and the Sudanese people are resilient. And today they have started their march towards toppling the de facto governments in the country. The only thing you can do, I mean, we'll do our exercise inside the country, but we look forward, and this I must stress for international solidarity. And this is a basic element. We have learned a lot from international solidarity and the contribution of international solidarity. And I think that our comrades and our colleagues in Britain, the Coalition Against War in Britain, I think this is a very good step and it's really supported. And I think this is a key organization which will help a lot to assist, be it in the movements inside the country, as well as in spreading the information and so on about the struggle of the Sudanese people. However, once again, I must thank again the editorial board of Liberation and hope that such forum would continue in the future. And not only about the Sudan, but also about other areas, burning areas like Gaza and India, for example. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so very much. And throughout this meeting, thank you to all three of our panelists. Jeremy has had to leave again for parliamentary duties, I believe, but thank you to all three of our panelists, in particular to Fathi for joining us to give us that voice directly from the progressive movements in Sudan. And I think throughout this meeting, the crucial point that has come across is the importance of us building that direct solidarity, of us making sure that those voices are heard and that we start to pressure our own government around these issues. So I know that over coming days and weeks, certainly from the GFTU's perspective, we'll be very keen to speak to Liberation, to the Stop the War Coalition, and to start to build that practical activity which can spread this message further and can make sure that we work to bring both the trade union movement and progressive forces in this country into taking solidarity action with the progressive movement in Sudan and with those democratic forces fighting for peace and for change in Sudan. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Liberation and Stop the War for organising this meeting this evening, and to all the volunteers on the chat who've helped make that possible. And of course, thank you to all those who've attended the meeting and who I know will go out and redouble their efforts to build that solidarity with progressive forces in Sudan. Please do make sure that you've signed up to, affiliated to, join Stop the War and Liberation, because it is through building these mass movements that we're able to coordinate, to express our solidarity with the people of Sudan and with people right across the world. Thank you, everyone.